I hate it. I hate it. And dark bleatings, everyone. I wanted to talk about horror books and horror films and TV, and I didn't know what to do first, so I decided to smush everything together in this one video. So today I'm doing the 10 best and worst book to screen horror adaptations. I say best and worst. These are just kind of like a handful of my personal least favorites, the ones I don't like, and then a few that I think are really good. If I tried to do best and worst and I actually had to rank them, I would have been there forever trying to put the list together. So without further ado, let's just briefly cover what is a good adaptation. I talked about this a little bit before. I made a video about 5 good book to screen adaptations, and I'll link that video in the description if you're interested in that. I won't be going back over anything I mentioned there in this video. So an adaptation of a book or a comic or anything put onto the screen is a screen version, like a film or a TV version of a book, basically. And there's some debate about what makes a good adaptation. A lot of things are good films in their own right, but not very good adaptations of the source material. For me personally, a good adaptation is something that doesn't necessarily keep everything from the book exactly the same, but if things need to be adapted to suit the medium of the screen more, then the changes that are made are thoughtful and good, without things done for the sake of it. If things need to be cut because there isn't enough runtime, so in, for example, Lord of the Rings, quite a lot was cut from the Fellowship of the Ring. There was this whole forest section, and people are going to be mad at me, I can't remember the guy, Tom something, I think, but he was cut from it anyway, because it wasn't really imperative to the story. It was just like part of the whimsy and the journey and everything, so they cut that out for film purposes, stuff like that. But I think that an adaptation, a good adaptation, is something that maintains the point of the original story, and maybe the feel of it as well, captures the atmosphere and what the author originally intended for the story, and then maybe even elevates the story, makes changes that are good. Maybe there are a few famous cases. Frank Darabont famously changed the ending of The Mist by Stephen King for the film adaptation, and there's so much discourse about that, completely different endings, but a lot of people think that that was a good move. Stephen King also thought that that was a better ending than the one he wrote. So there are like examples. So let's get into it, and I'll explain myself a little bit. I'm going to try not to ramble as much as I usually do, because I know I'm quite the rambler, and if what you get you think is a ramble, you should see the unedited videos. I cut quite a lot of myself out, so we'll see how that goes anyway. Also, there's a few things here that I hate, and I'm going to try not to rant. Okay, so we're going to go good, bad, good, bad, good, bad. So our first good one, the Pet Sematary original film from 1989, directed by Mary Lambert. I just had to check my notes to make sure I didn't get that wrong. Yeah, so 1989, based on the book by Stephen King, Pet Sematary. And the reason I think that this original film is a really good adaptation is because it really captured the feel of the book. The book Pet Sematary, for anyone who doesn't know, I'm not going to spoil anything, is about a family of 4, husband, wife, daughter, and then sort of like a toddler son, move to this new house for the husband's new job. Something horrible happens, and one of the neighbors tells him about a cemetery, an unofficial cemetery, where it might actually be a better idea not to bury anyone or anything there. And then the husband kind of takes that information later and does something terrible with it. And the main thing about the book, the main takeaway that a lot of people have, is that it is the greatest depiction and exploration of grief that's ever been written. So few things I mean, I don't know if anything actually measures up to Pet Sematary on how well Stephen King managed to capture the reality of grief so well. It's so weird that it's such a hard emotion to convey to a reader, even though most of us have experienced grief or will experience grief. It's such a universal experience, but it's so hard to translate in a way that actually pulls at people's heartstrings, like, really effectively. That's what Pet Sematary is known for, and the horror of Pet Sematary comes from those deepest, most awful feelings that you have. The original movie, I felt, tonally really captured it, and it also did a great job with the horror aspects. There are some cheesy things about it. It is 1989 that it was made, so like there are a few things that look a little bit dated now with the filming and everything, and you know, you never know what you're gonna get with child actors, and you really can't judge them too harshly. But I thought for like an adaptation of the book, they made a couple of little changes and stuff, but basically it very much was really faithful to the story, captured the point of the story, and just, yeah, put it on the screen and made a great horror movie out of it. Okay, bad. I'm not going to do this with everyone. Pet Sematary, the remake that was released in 2019. This was directed by Kevin Kolsch and Dennis Whitmire. Sorry if I've mispronounced those names. So the Pet Sematary remake, I gave it a fair shot because I really like the story, but I had a bad feeling that they were gonna just take what people liked from the original and misunderstand what people liked from the original, so or the book. So even if you've never seen the original film and you're not comparing it as a remake and you're just looking at it as an adaptation of the book, it so missed the point. And I thought that the performances were good and everything. It's not like a criticism of the actors, but they just so missed the point of Pet Sematary. They made a change, and again, I don't want to give spoilers for this, but they made a fairly major change, and I knew that this change had been made before I watched the film, and I thought, I bet that they've just done that so that they can create more scary, this kind of film scenes. And if you've seen it, you'll know what I'm talking about. And it was just sort of like aesthetics over substance. If I, like, they sort of misunderstood, like, people were really affected by this element from the main story and then the first film, and they misunderstood why people were affected by it and just thought, oh, we know, we'll do scary thing here. And it wasn't scary because of it. It like ruined the horror for me. So I just thought that they completely missed the point. They went for stuff that they could throw into a trailer. Your classic modern horror schlock is what it turned into for me. I'm not saying I could write a better film. This is just me criticizing things, but I didn't like it as a remake, I didn't like it as a horror film, and I didn't like it as an adaptation. I just felt like, for me, it didn't work on any count. Okay, next, another goodie, a TV show, You. I very briefly talked about this when I talked about the book. So the book, based on the book You by, right, hang on. The show You is based on the book You by Carol and Kepnes. We're just going to talk about the first season just so I don't go off forever in this video. So what's weird about the TV show is that quite a lot was changed, but you wouldn't know that. If you knew like the basic story of the book, you'd think they'd been really faithful in the show, but they made some really necessary changes to translate this to a story that people would want to watch. So You is about Joe Goldberg. He's a bookstore clerk, manager, whatever, and he sees a woman come in one day. He's sort of immediately infatuated with her, and it's presented in the show as sort of romantic. This guy's he reads the classics. He's an old school romantic. He sees a woman and actually wants to court her, and he, on paper, Joe Goldberg in the show is somebody that a lot of us would want to date, but I saw the show first and I was really excited to read the book because I thought, oh, there'll be a bit more depth in the book and I'll get to like know Joe a little bit more. He's a completely different character in the book. This isn't a spoiler, this is something that's revealed like straight up in both things. So Joel Goldberg is not a romantic, he's a stalker, and he's pretty deranged, and he's misogynistic, he makes a lot of assumptions, he's arrogant, he thinks quite a lot of his own opinions, thinks quite a lot of himself. He very much considers himself like a really good person that at times is forced to do bad things for the people he loves, and isn't that what all the great romantic books teach you to do, etc. So when I read the book after watching the show, I expected more of that sort of like that deluded romantic idea about himself. But book Joe Goldberg is absolutely vile. He is kidding himself that he thinks he's a better person than he is, but also he doesn't care. He doesn't care. So there are a few things that they did in the show that softened him, and one of the major things for people is that he has a next door neighbor called Claudia, and she's in an abusive relationship, and she has a son called Paco. I think he's about 12ish, and Joe really looks out for him, and there's nothing like we need to worry about with that relationship, that there's any sort of like violent ulterior motives or anything. Joe just really cares about this kid because he had a bad childhood and he recognizes it in Paco, and he goes out of his way to cheer Paco up, give him books, you know, talk to him, be a friend, and look out for him. Paco, it doesn't exist in the book, so without that element and no example of Joe being a decent human being, there is nothing to soften the heinous side. And the heinous side in the book is so much worse. Like the language he uses when he's thinking about Beck is disgusting. A lot of c-word stuff, just vulgar thoughts, vulgar language, like the kind of thoughts you would expect to be in the head of somebody who stalks and harms women. Shoujo Goldberg couldn't have been that way because no one would have watched it. So like people compare it to Dexter. The reason that people like Dexter as a character is because even though Dexter is a serial killer, a sociopathic serial killer, he has an honor code. He only kills people who are killers and they've somehow evaded the law. So he won't just kill someone outright. If they get arrested and justice does its job, then he stays out of it. So I don't know, people keep making this comparison between Shoujo Goldberg and Dexter, and Shoujo Goldberg is not Dexter. Dexter is arguably a better person than Joe. Yeah, they couldn't possibly have depicted Joe the same way as he is in the book, because nobody would have got behind a character or been interested in watching a character that has absolutely no likable qualities at all, no relatable qualities. The other thing about the book as well is that Beck is very much depicted as, she's kind of an asshole. So in the show, she's not perfect. She's just sort of a normal woman with her own struggles. She's a bit self-involved. She is sneaky. She's not perfect. And that was kind of the point, in that it's not only these perfect princess-like girls that get targeted by these sickos. It could be anybody, and Joe is just putting her on a pedestal and holding her to standards that she hasn't set for herself, that she hasn't tried to convey to other people. He's just made his own decisions about her based on his own fantasies, and he's projecting. I think that Showbeck, you know, she's very flawed, but she's a very understandable character. Even like, I don't like a lot of her decisions, and she can be a dick, but she's basically a normal person. Bookbeck is a normal girl, but she's very clearly using him. She's very clearly not really interested in Joe at all at any point, unlike the Beck in the show. And there's no reason why anybody should be so interested in her. So as well as having a protagonist that we really wouldn't want to watch, we've got a victim that we don't root for either in the book. Not that she deserves it in the book, but you know what I mean, like it's easier to feel really emotionally involved if you actually care about the character in the first place. So I think that that was a really good adaptation, because it took the source material and it made it something that also works on the screen. It keeps the main message, Joe bad, this behavior bad, beware, but it just like sort of made the characters a little bit less one-dimensional. A bad example of a TV show, and I don't have as much to say about this because I don't wanna, is the TV adaptation of The Mist by Stephen King. So I talked about the film, I'm not going to talk about that again, but the film is spectacular as a horror film and an adaptation. The TV show completely missed the point of The Mist. It so a mist rolls into this town. So in the book, there's a huge storm. This really weird mist rolls into this small town, and it's basically about a group of people that are trapped in a store because there's stuff in the mist and they can't see through the mist to know what's in it. Obviously it's a really thick mist, but there are monsters in it, and you know, if you go out there you'll die. So they're just kind of trapped in this horrible scenario. They don't even know what the threat is. They don't know when it might be over, if this mist is ever going to lift, whatever. And it's a really good story of the way that humanity so quickly divides itself when it's in a panic like that and we're thrust into the unknown. And the film did a good job of portraying that. Made some good cuts though. And then the TV show is about a town where this mist rolls in, and then everyone's secret starts coming out, and there's, I don't know, the stuff that's in the like, the way they used the mist in the show was just so disappointing, because when I heard they were making a TV show out of it, I was so excited for that. I wasn't expecting them to stick to the story of the book, because that very much is a film. It's not a season, it's not a series worth of stuff. But I thought, oh, if they were like using the same thing but they were showing us different people around the town surviving, that would be really cool. But no, it's it's just crap. Okay, on to the next good. I'm going to get some flack for this one because I looked online before I started making this video to see what other people's opinions were, and I think I'm an island on this. But I think that World War Z was a good adaptation of the book by Max Brooks, World War Z. So I think people who are big fans of the book tend to not like this film very much. So the book is about the zombie apocalypse, and it's told from so many different viewpoints, but they're very impersonal. So we're seeing like reports, stuff from the military, news, stuff like that, and it's like from all over the world, just sort of showing us the downfall of society and humanity basically all over the world. And you kind of get the story through pieces of what everyone is saying, because not everyone has the same information. It was a really interesting way to tell a story. I personally wasn't a massive fan of the book though, because I'm very character centric, and because there was no main character for me to grasp, I found it a bit hard to be very invested in what was going on. And Max Brooks said that, you know, the main character is humanity, and yes, that's fine, but when we're talking about a narrative and a storytelling structure, there isn't a main character for all intents and purposes. It's I get what he's saying, but it's in a storytelling format that doesn't work the way it typically would. The film gave us a main character, so someone to follow and a family to root for, and they get split up, and we've got running zombies, which I really liked. Running zombies are always scary, and it did make some changes. I don't think it's a perfect film, but as adaptations go, to tell the story of this sort of like worldwide devastation, I did think that it added something, that we had some more localized people to care about, rather than just scene after scene of just around the world with no one to grasp. I don't think that would have worked on screen. So I think that it did capture the essence of the overall story, but it just made it easier to care about what was happening. The bad, The Shining. Now hear me out. Yes, I am talking about the 1980 version directed by Stanley Kubrick. Now, first and foremost, I think it's a really good horror film. I think The Shining as a standalone movie is great. I'm not going to sit here and say that it's a bad film at all. It's great. I've seen it so many times. I'm not a huge fan of Jack Nicholson in it. I like Jack Nicholson, but for Jack Torrance, I didn't really like him. But I think it's a really good horror film. However, it's a bad adaptation because it misses the point of the book. Story in the book is about the Torrance family, Jack, Wendy, and Danny. Jack gets a job as the caretaker of the Overlook Hotel in the off season when it's closed, and he's just there to look after the place, maintain the boiler, just keep the place ticking over until tourists come back. And he's a novelist, so it's a perfect opportunity for him to work on his next book. And the idea is they can spend some good quality family time together, the three of them. There have been some issues. Jack is an alcoholic who is currently not drinking, and he's working on that. There have been incidents in the past with Danny and Wendy, so they are very much not like a perfect family unit, but they love each other. They're trying to work on things. Jack very much has a conscience and feels very badly about some of his behavior, and he's trying to make up for it, and he very much loves his family. Knowing the kind of stuff that Jack did, I didn't like him in the book, but I appreciated that he was somebody who was fighting his demons and trying to do better, and he was very much about his wife and his son. And the book, with the interference of the Overlook, which is haunted, it's very sad to read the decline and destruction of this family that are all trying so hard. The film, Jack starts off as a raving asshole immediately in the first scenes. You can already tell he hates his wife. He's got no patience for his son. It's not surprising or much of a character change at all when the hotel's influence starts getting to him, because he looked like he had the capacity to chase them around with an axe in the first place. So I think the point of the book, which was very much about love and the family unit and the forces that can ruin it, and it's very much a metaphor for addiction and the destructive side effects of addiction, and how it affects the people that you love and yourself and your relationships and everything. I just feel like that was so completely missed in the like, it was like Stanley Kubrick when I can't be bothered with that, I just want to do the ghost. And I think that Stanley Kubrick was really talented, visionary, but yeah, missed the point of the book and just really wanted the setting, is what I think. So yeah, great film, terrible adaptation. And I'll just briefly mention, there is another version of The Shining, a 2-part miniseries that I think Stephen King and Mick Garris did together. It's not the best, didn't have as big a budget, obviously, but it is truer to the book. So, you know, that exists if you wanted to check it out. Next, good. 30 Days of Night. One of the best vampire films of all time, in my opinion. It's in the top 3 for me. I think it was number 2. I've seen it 1,000 times, and it's based on the graphic novels by, the graphic novels by Steve Niles, with art by Ben Templesmith. So yeah, Steve Niles and Ben Templesmith. So the graphic novel. So it's so the story is about a town called Barrow in Alaska, where the sun goes down for 30 days. And so there's just darkness for a full month. And a lot of people in the town leave because they don't want to be there for that part of the season, because a lot of people can't cope with the sun just not coming up, and it's very cold, obviously. So it's just a small group of people left, comparatively. It's a small town anyway, but a smaller group of people are left, and vampires come. And it's just one of the best ideas for vampire fiction, possibly the single best premise for vampire fiction I've ever heard, because that we all, you know, I say we all as if they're real, generally speaking, in vampire fiction, the daytime is safe. Like, that's the rule. You're only in danger at night, and only if you make yourself vulnerable in certain ways. These vampires as well are not the kind you can reason with. They seem very old. They've got their own language. They're just stone cold killers, and their whole purpose is to wipe every single person out in Barrow so that there's no one left to tell anyone about them. And it's just a big bloodthirsty feeding frenzy. And I thought that the film is an amazing horror film, brilliant vampire film, and it's also a really good adaptation of what was like set down in the graphic novels. It's fairly faithful. It takes some liberties in some places, but yeah, it's a tight narrative, and this property in general has just spawned great adaptations. So the graphic novels are really entertaining and scary, and then the film is absolutely incredible. Like, they couldn't possibly have done a better job with it. And then there's a novelization of the movie by Tim Lebbon, which is actually my favorite iteration of the story. Like, I love the films and the film and the graphic novel, so that's saying something, that the novelization of the film is my favorite way the story's been told. And then it's spawned a bunch of other stuff. There's like, you know, there are other novels and things in universe and everything, but yeah, it's just yeah, I was so impressed with it. I just loved it so much. The bad, bear with me on this, Queen of the Damned from 2002. That was directed by, oh, I forgot to say, 30 Days of Night from 2007 was directed by David Slade, and that is the guy that directed Twilight Eclipse. And I had a feeling, so I didn't recognise the director's name when I saw Eclipse, but that opening scene where Riley is being chased by scary, lightning fast, bloodthirsty vampires and it's just all terror, I was like, wow, this feels more like a scene from 30 Days of Night. And then I looked up the director and it was just so funny to me. And I honestly think that is the best Twilight film in my opinion, and it's very much to do with the director, I think, who's actually done scary vampires before, so that was like the perfect guy. But anyway, that was my small mini tangent. So Queen of the Damned, another vampire fiction. So this is based on the book by Anne Rice, and it was in her series, The Vampire Chronicles. So it's an adaptation of the book and also a sort of loose sequel to the film that was made in the 90s with Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt, Interview with the Vampire. So because they made this, yeah, so 2002, so Tom Cruise played Lestat in Interview with the Vampire, and obviously just because of time and age he wouldn't have been able to reprise this role now because vampires don't age, and Tom Cruise, you know, I don't mean this insultingly, but he would have aged and aged out of being able to play it the way he looked originally. So I think that everyone was fine with knowing that someone else was going to play Lestat. But the problem for me, so the book The Queen of the Damned, so the series goes Interview with the Vampire, The Vampire Lestat, The Queen of the Damned. So Interview with the Vampire is Louis' story about how he was turned into a vampire by Lestat, and Lestat is very much someone who really enjoys being in his vampire element. He doesn't have any remorse, he enjoys the killing, he enjoys terrorizing people, he enjoys the fruits of being a vampire and having special powers. Louis is very tortured about it. He's much more sympathetic in the film than he is in the book, I will say, because he's got some assholey qualities in the book, but overall that was a really good adaptation of the book. It captured the gothic feel, the time period and all of that. And then The Vampire Lestat, the book, is Lestat's story, and it's very detailed, his whole history and everything, and there's some really good funny stuff. Like, Lestat is a funny character. I feel like he would be friends with Damon Salvatore from the Vampire Diaries if like the worlds merged. But he's vicious, but he's funny. And then, so that's all of his story. And then The Queen of the Damned is about Akasha, a vampire queen, the first vampire, being sort of revived by Lestat, and then she wakes up in this new world where vampires are suddenly hiding and they're not out in the open, and she forms this sort of kinship with Lestat because he very much wants to be out in the open as well. He doesn't want to hide his nature anymore. He doesn't see why he should have to fade into the shadows so that humans don't know they exist and things. And the problem with the film, even though I do think when it came out it was very much appealing to the teen and young adult new metal goth market, of which I was a proud member. So this whole soundtrack, it was Jonathan Davis from Korn, Marilyn Manson, Deftones, like all the kind of bands that I was listening to, and the aesthetic, you know, like everyone was dressed how I wanted to dress, and Lestat was sexy and all of this, but I just felt like that film went for a bit more style over substance, firstly, and I actually think that the film is decent. I watched it recently expecting to be cringing at my former self and how much I loved it, but I actually thought the film was fine. There isn't really anything much I can pick holes in about the film. It's like it's a decent vampire film, but Stuart Townsend, it's not Lestat. It's not book Lestat. It's not the Lestat that Tom Cruise played. It's like a completely alien character, and basically the Vampire Chronicles is Lestat. So I was like, okay, if they want to go in a bit of a different direction. And the other thing is, they melded the stories from the Vampire Lestat and the Queen of the Damned books to make this film, but they cut all of the really good stuff from both books out, and they just kept the bare bones of some of the more simple things. And I thought that was a shame, because there was so much scope for Akasha and so much scope for Lestat. I could feel like it would have been better to have broken it into several films and like followed the books a little bit more faithfully. So yeah, if you kind of like the basic story of the Queen of the Damned, but you want it much deeper with a lot more, there's a lot more death and destruction in the books, like maybe pick the books up. But yeah, a fine film, but just bad adaptation. Okay, we're on to our last good and bad. So good, The Ritual, 2007, directed by David Bruckner, and this is based on the book by Adam Nevill. So The Ritual is about 4 guys who go hiking. I always get it wrong. It's either the Swedish or the Swiss, is it? Norwegian wilderness. And they're going to honour a friend whose passed. They all used to take these trips together. They were like friends in uni and stuff. So they're going for like this last trip, and they're all flawed people. They've all grown. Our main character is floundering a little bit. He doesn't really feel connected to the others anymore, especially one of them. They've all just grown differently, grown apart over time with age and everything, and they've all been affected by things differently. And so not only is this trip just fraught with like, maybe this wasn't the best idea for them, maybe they can't as a group spend this much close time intensely together anymore, but also there's something in the woods. And again, I'm not going to spoil anything, but the about 2/3 of the way into the book, there is such a tonal shift in the narrative when a new element is introduced, that initially in the book I laughed out loud when we got to it. Like, I wasn't laughing at the book, but I was so surprised, and I actually thought it was a really ballsy move on Adam Neville's part, because this could well have not worked, and it wouldn't on screen. It 100% would not work on screen, because it's too much of a shift. But like, if you just go with it for the book, I ended up really enjoying this element and it worked for the story. But if you tried to do what he did in a film, you probably would lose all of your audience or half your audience at that point. So the film very much was in keeping with the feel of the book. The journeys of the characters, the relationships were all as they were in the book, and also the horror was captured, like this realization that the guys have slowly, that there's something in the woods, and then they realize there's something possibly quite unnatural in the woods. It really captured that, like, that build, and like the fear, the panic and the hopelessness. It got all of that, but it just went in a bit of a different direction for the 3rd act, that was more in keeping with the tone of the film. So I just thought they did a really great job with that. This is the final one, and I briefly touched on this in another video. I don't even remember what video, and I'm not gonna, I said I wasn't gonna rant, and I've just thought about it, and it's made me mad. And I'll fight anyone on this. I Am Legend. I hate it, and why can't they just do an adaptation of this book? The book's by Richard Matheson, by the way. Why can't they just do an adaptation that's like the story of the book? I need to calm down, everything's fine. So anyway, the book is about Robert Nevill. He's the last living human. A disease ravaged humankind, and basically it's everyone has turned into vampires, and not weird CGI zombie vampire things, vampires that are still, you know, conscious of what they're doing and cognitive, and all of the other words beginning with C. I've got lots of words. There's a particular 4-lettered word beginning with C that I'd apply to this film in general. And Robert Nevill is the last one, and he's a doctor slash scientist who's still trying to cure this affliction. And the book was really ahead of its time for its sort of slight medical sci-fi elements, but also it's really a story about like very intense loneliness in a world where if he conformed, he'd have community again, but it's wrong, and so he's trying to save himself and humanity, and he's basically making himself a pariah to do this, because obviously the alternative of, like, you know, becoming one of them is quite terrifying, but that might be preferable than spending day and night, every day and night, alone with no company, no one but yourself, and never knowing if you're going to see another normal human being again. And it was just really poignant, and it's a great story, and there are great scenes of horror in it. They've made a few adaptations of this. There are some older versions that people was like, oh, if you like I Am Legend, you should watch The Omega Man. I didn't like that either. I didn't think, I thought that that went a bit too weird with the vampire stuff. I can't remember what the other film was called, but there was another one. But this Will Smith, I was so excited to see the Will Smith version, because the rumours at the time when it was announced that they were making this was that the casting was going to be Edward Norton as Robert Nevill, which I actually thought was perfect, even though Robert Neville's older in the book, and Johnny Depp as this vampire called Ben Cortman. That's like, he was like an old co-worker of Robert Neville's before everything went to shit, and he's basically turns up outside his house every night plaguing him and taunting him and things. And it's like, so you've got a main character with like a real adversary, where their relationship wasn't like, they weren't the best of friends in the first place, but now it's really complicated, because this isn't even all Ben Cortman's fault. It's not his fault, he's a vampire. But it gives a very tangible, like, sort of like good versus evil, us versus them kind of vibe. Like, there's just so much meat in the book, like so much subtle extra stuff. And then I was like, oh, Will Smith, okay, well they've changed their minds about the casting, where that's absolutely fine. And Will Smith is a good actor, so I was really excited to see it, and I have never been so angry in a cinema in my entire life. Well, I have, but we're not going to talk about Alien Covenant again. So anyway, the film is Robert Nevill is the last human alive, and everybody else is a shitty CGI creature that's more like a zombie than a vampire. I mean, they're not completely unintelligent, but they seem fairly mindless. And I guess they did, like, the loneliness aspect was captured, but they stripped everything fun out of the story. See, like, this is the thing. So while I have to hold my hands up and say they did capture, I guess, the one of the key elements of the original story is that alone kind of thing. They did capture that, but the vampire stuff made for much more fun horror. Shitty, nasty vampires yelling things at you in the middle of the night, driving you insane. And there was like a whole bunch of other stuff where, because they were vampires, they were just better scenes. Like, Robert Nevill in the book spends his days going around in houses looking for vampires to stake, so that there are fewer of them at night that are gonna surround his house. It's just, they did similar things in the film, but I feel like they just stripped the personality out of the villains. I say villains, and that's another thing. There is a main overall point in I Am Legend, which I don't want to say here because it's kind of a spoiler, but they missed that entirely in the film as well. There apparently was an alternative ending that was more in keeping with the book, and I wish they'd kept that alternative ending rather than what they did. But yeah, it missed the overall underlying point of the book, and took all of the fun out of it, so that the whole film was just a big depressing, well acted, admittedly, clusterfuck that did not honour the original source. Does anyone else think she needs to get a life? Subscribe. So there you have it, my opinion on 5 of the best and 5 of the worst adaptations. I'd love to know what you think, if you agree or disagree with any of these, or if there are any that you haven't seen, or any of these that you have seen and you didn't realise they were based on a book. I could tell you a bit more about the book if you were interested in picking anything up. Yeah, I think I'll just stop the babble there. I will be back tomorrow gaming fearfully with Mikey Silent Hill 2 with another book video on Saturday, and we got an author interview on Sunday as per usual. So I hope that you enjoyed this video. Bleed!